When fake HOA scammers broke my 82-year-old grandfather's arm over made-up fees, they picked the wrong family to mess with. My biker cousins from the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club decided to teach these criminals a lesson they'd never forget, and burned their entire operation to the ground. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The sound of my grandfather's scream still haunts my dreams. It was a Thursday morning when I got the call that changed everything. A call that would unleash a fury I never knew existed within our family. "Sarah, you need to get to the hospital. Now." My mom's voice was shaking, barely holding back sobs. "It's Grandpa Joe. They broke his arm." My hands trembled as I dropped my coffee mug, watching it shatter across my kitchen floor just like my world was about to shatter. Grandpa Joe wasn't just my grandfather. He was my hero, my anchor, the man who raised me when my parents were too busy chasing their careers to notice their daughter needed them. As I raced through the hospital corridors, my mind flooded with memories. Grandpa teaching me to ride a bike in his perfectly manicured driveway. His weathered hands showing me how to plant tomatoes in his pristine garden. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed at my terrible jokes. At 82, he was still the strongest person I knew, not physically but in spirit. Which made what I was about to see even more devastating. The hospital room felt suffocating. There he was, my invincible grandfather, looking so small and fragile in that sterile bed. His right arm was in a cast from wrist to elbow, his face bruised and swollen. But it wasn't the physical injuries that broke my heart, it was the look in his eyes. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in Joseph Martinez's eyes. "Mija," he whispered when he saw me, using the Spanish endearment he'd called me since I was little, even though we weren't Hispanic. It was just his way of making everyone feel like family. I collapsed into the chair beside his bed, taking his good hand in both of mine. "Grandpa, what happened?" "Mom said something about the HOA, but that doesn't make sense. You've lived in that house for 40 years. His jaw tightened, and I saw a flicker of the old fire return to his eyes. "These men came to my door this morning. Said they were from the new HOA management company. Started yelling about violations. My garden, my fence, even my American flag. Said I owed thousands in fines. But Grandpa, your neighborhood doesn't have an HOA. You've told me that story 100 times, how you specifically chose that house because there were no restrictions." That's what I told them. His voice cracked. "But they had official-looking papers, badges, the whole 9 yards. When I refused to let them in, when I told them to get off my property." He paused, struggling with the memory. "The big one, he grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back. Said I was being non-compliant with HOA regulations. The smaller one was filming everything, saying they needed documentation of my resistance." Rage. Pure, white-hot rage coursed through my veins like nothing I'd ever experienced. "They filmed themselves assaulting you?" When I tried to pull away, I heard the crack. Then I was on the ground and they were gone. Tears rolled down his cheeks, tears I'd never seen from the man who'd been my rock for 25 years. I wanted to punch something. I wanted to scream. Instead, I squeezed his hand and tried to keep my voice steady. "Did you call the police?" I tried, Mija. But when the officers came, they said without witnesses or clear evidence, it was my word against theirs. The men had disappeared. No company name on the papers they left, no way to trace them. That's when my cousin Marcus walked in, and I knew everything was about to change. Marcus was my age but had taken a very different path in life. Where I'd gone to college and became a social worker, Marcus had found his family in the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club. He was covered in tattoos, wore leather like a second skin, and had a reputation that made grown men cross the street. But underneath all that intimidating exterior was a heart of gold and a fierce loyalty to family that ran deeper than blood. "Uncle Joe," he said softly, his usual gruff voice breaking. Marcus called all the family elders uncle and aunt, out of respect. "What did those bastards do to you?" As Grandpa repeated his story, I watched Marcus's face transform. His jaw clenched tighter with each detail, his knuckles turning white as his hands balled into fists. When Grandpa finished, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You still got those papers they left?" Grandpa nodded toward his clothes bag. Marcus pulled out several official-looking documents, complete with letterheads, signatures, and legal jargon that might fool someone who wasn't looking too closely. "This is professional," Marcus muttered, studying the papers. "Too professional for random scammers. This is organized." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean, little cousin, that these aren't just opportunistic thieves. This is a sophisticated operation targeting elderly homeowners. And if they're doing it to Uncle Joe, they're doing it to others." Over the next few hours as Grandpa rested and healed, Marcus and I did some investigating. What we found made my blood boil even hotter. Using social media and neighborhood apps, we discovered that this wasn't an isolated incident. At least 6 other elderly residents in surrounding neighborhoods had been targeted by similar scams in the past month. The pattern was always the same: official-looking documents, demands for immediate payment of fabricated HOA fees, and escalating intimidation tactics when victims refused to comply. Mrs. Chin, a 78-year-old widow, had her garden destroyed when she refused to pay $3,000 in landscaping violation fees. Mr. Patterson, an 81-year-old veteran, had his car windows smashed after challenging their authority. But none of the other victims had been physically assaulted like Grandpa. He'd been the first to fight back and they'd made an example of him. "This ends now," Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet. "Nobody hurts family. Nobody. I should have been worried about what my cousin was planning. I should have convinced him to let the proper authorities handle it. But seeing my grandfather, my hero, broken and afraid had awakened something primal in me. Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes justice has to come from unexpected places." That evening Marcus brought reinforcements. 5 other members of the Iron Wolves showed up at my apartment, each one looking like they could bench press a Harley. But as intimidating as they appeared, they listened respectfully as I told them what we'd learned about the scam operation. "Here's what we know," I said, spreading out our research on my dining table. "They're calling themselves Premier Community Management Services. They target elderly homeowners in neighborhoods without established HOAs. They create fake violations, demand immediate payment, and when people refuse, they escalate to property damage and intimidation. And now assault," added Jake, Marcus's club president, a mountain of a man with graying temples and surprisingly kind eyes. "The problem is proving it," I continued. "They don't leave real contact information. They use different names each time. And they're smart enough to pick isolated targets who are less likely to fight back or have support systems." "What about their base of operations?" asked Tommy, the club's sergeant-at-arms. Marcus grinned, an expression that would have terrified anyone who didn't know him. "That's where it gets interesting. I did some digging through my alternative information sources. Cross-referenced the fake company names with recent business filings, traced some vehicle descriptions from the other victims." He pulled out his phone and showed us a grainy photo of a warehouse district across town. "They're operating out of a storage facility on Industrial Boulevard. Unit 47. I've got a buddy who works security there, says they've been renting the space for about 2 months, paying cash, lots of coming and going at odd hours." "So what's the plan?" I asked, surprised by my own eagerness for whatever retribution they had in mind. Jake leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "You sure you want to know, Sarah? Because once you're in, you're in. And what we're planning, let's just say it's not going to involve filing complaints with the Better Business Bureau." I thought about Grandpa's broken arm. About the fear in his eyes. About Mrs. Chen crying over her destroyed roses. About Mr. Patterson, a man who'd served his country with honor, having to sweep broken glass from his driveway. I'm in. The next morning we put our plan into motion. It was surprisingly sophisticated for a group of bikers. A testament to the fact that these men were far more intelligent and strategic than their appearances suggested. Phase 1 involved gathering evidence. Marcus's girlfriend Tina, who worked as a paralegal, helped us understand what we needed to make a solid case. We needed video evidence of the scam in action, documentation of their operation, and proof of the threats and violence they'd used against victims. That's where I came in. Using social media stalking skills I'd developed as a social worker trying to track down deadbeat parents, I'd identified the likely members of the scam ring. 3 men in their 30s and 40s, all with criminal records for fraud and assault. They were using stolen identities and fake business registrations, but they'd gotten sloppy with their social media presence. The plan was simple but dangerous. I would pose as a potential victim, a young woman who'd recently inherited her grandmother's house and was confused about the sudden HOA demands. I'd arrange to meet them at a neutral location, wearing a hidden camera, and try to get them to admit to their scam on video. "Absolutely not," Marcus said when I proposed this. "These guys broke an 82-year-old man's arm. You think they'll hesitate to hurt you? That's exactly why it has to be me," I argued. "They target elderly people because they seem vulnerable. They won't see me as a threat. And if something goes wrong..." "If something goes wrong, we'll be right there," Jake promised. "But Sarah, these aren't playground bullies. These are dangerous men running a criminal operation." I knew the risks, But I also knew that traditional law enforcement had failed. The police had already dismissed Grandpa's case due to lack of evidence. The other victims were too scared or too isolated to push for justice. If we didn't stop these men, they'd keep hurting people. So 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop downtown, wearing a tiny camera disguised as an earring and trying to control my racing heart. I'd arranged to meet David from Premier Community Management to discuss the urgent HOA violations at my recently inherited property. He showed up exactly on time, a tall, thin man in his late 30s with slicked back hair and a cheap suit that was trying too hard to look expensive. Everything about him screamed con artist, but I could see how he might fool someone who wasn't looking for red flags. "Miss Johnson?" he said, extending his hand. "David Mitchell, Premier Community Management. Thank you for meeting with me to resolve this situation." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip designed to establish dominance. "Thank you for being flexible with the timing. I'm still trying to figure out all the legal stuff with my grandmother's house." Of course. These situations can be overwhelming, especially for young people who aren't familiar with community regulations. His tone was perfectly calibrated, sympathetic but authoritative. For the next 20 minutes, David spun an elaborate tale about HOA violations at my fictional inherited property. Overgrown landscaping, non-compliant paint colors, unauthorized fence modifications, each one carrying hefty fines that had been accumulating with interest during the months since my fictional grandmother's death. "The total comes to $8,347, he said, sliding an official-looking invoice across the table. "Now, I understand this is a substantial amount, especially for someone in your situation. But the good news is we're authorized to offer a settlement discount for immediate payment." "Immediate payment?" I asked, plain confused and overwhelmed. "Cash or certified check today, and we can reduce the total to $5,000. It's really the best deal you're going to get, and it prevents the liens and legal action that would otherwise be inevitable." I stared at the fake invoice, letting appropriate shock and worry cross my face. I don't have that kind of money just sitting around. And I thought my grandmother said the neighborhood didn't have an HOA. David's expression hardened slightly, just a flash, but enough to remind me who I was dealing with. "Ma'am, I understand this is stressful, but ignorance of community regulations isn't a legal defense. These violations exist whether your grandmother was aware of them or not." "But what if I can't pay today? I mean, I'd need time to get that kind of money together." "Well, that's where things get complicated." His voice took on a subtle, threatening tone. "You see, we've had issues with non-compliance in this community recently. Elderly residents who thought they could just ignore legal obligations. We've had to take stronger enforcement measures." My heart was pounding, but I pressed on. "What kind of enforcement measures?" "Let's just say that continued non-compliance can result in property damage assessments, personal liability issues, even physical enforcement of compliance orders. We had a situation just this week with an elderly gentleman who became combative when we attempted to serve him with similar documentation. There it was. He was essentially confessing to assaulting my grandfather, and I had it all on video. "I think I need to talk to a lawyer," I said, starting to gather my things. David's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, not hard enough to bruise but firm enough to stop me from leaving. "Ms. Johnson, I really wouldn't recommend involving lawyers at this stage. Legal fees would just add to your costs, and frankly, we prefer to handle these matters within the community. Lawyers tend to complicate things." The threat was clear and I had it recorded. But I also realized I might be in actual danger. David's grip on my wrist was tightening, and there was something cold in his eyes that made my skin crawl. That's when Marcus appeared at our table like an avenging angel in leather. "Excuse me," he said politely, but his presence immediately changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" David immediately released my wrist and forced a fake smile. "No problem at all. Ms. Johnson and I were just finishing up our business discussion." Marcus looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Everything okay, Sarah?" I nodded, gathering my courage. "Actually, I think I'm done here. This whole thing sounds like a scam." David's mask slipped completely. "Listen, lady, you can't just ignore legal obligations because you don't like them. We know where you live and we know you don't have many options." That was another mistake. Marcus stepped closer, and suddenly David's confident demeanor evaporated. "Did you just threaten my cousin?" Marcus asked quietly. No. This is just a business matter." Because it sounded like a threat to me. And I really don't like it when people threaten my family. David was already backing away, but Marcus wasn't done. "You know what? I think we should continue this conversation. Why don't you tell me about this business of yours? Premier Community Management, right? I have to go, David stammered, practically running for the door. But he was too late. Jake and Tommy were waiting in the parking lot, and they weren't about to let him leave without a chat. What happened next, I learned later, was a masterclass in psychological intimidation. The Iron Wolves didn't lay a hand on David, but they surrounded his car and made it very clear that he wasn't going anywhere until he answered some questions. Faced with 5 large, intimidating bikers, David's criminal bravado crumbled completely. Within 10 minutes he'd confessed to everything: the fake HOA scam, the targeting of elderly victims, the escalating intimidation tactics, and yes, the assault on my grandfather. Even better, Jake had been recording the entire conversation. But the Iron Wolves weren't satisfied with just a confession. They wanted justice, and they wanted to make sure this never happened to anyone else's family. Here's what's going to happen, Jake told David calmly. You're going to take us to your operation. You're going to show us everything: the fake documents, the victim lists, the money you've stolen. And then you're going to make this right. David, faced with no good options, agreed. The storage unit was exactly what we'd expected. A sophisticated fraud operation with computers, printers, filing cabinets full of fake documents, and even official-looking badges and uniforms. But what shocked me was the scale of it. They'd been targeting elderly homeowners across 3 counties, with victim files dating back over a year. Jesus, I whispered, looking through the filing cabinets. There are hundreds of victims here. Some files contained detailed surveillance photos of targets' homes. Others had research on victims' financial situations, family structures, and potential vulnerabilities. It was predatory and systematic in a way that made me physically sick. But the Iron Wolves had a plan for that too. While I documented everything with my camera, Marcus and Jake were having a very serious conversation with David about restitution. It turned out that the scammers had made over $200,000 in the past year, most of which was still sitting in various bank accounts. Here's the deal, Jake explained to David, who was now visibly shaking. You're going to liquidate every account, cash out every asset, and return every penny to the people you stole from. We've got the victim files, so we know exactly who deserves what. And if I refuse? David asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. Marcus smiled, that same terrifying expression I'd seen at the hospital. Well, then we might have to get creative. See, we've got video of you confessing to assault, fraud, and threatening witnesses. We've got evidence of your entire operation. And we've got a very creative approach to community justice. Tommy held up a gasoline can that hadn't been there before. We could always just torch this whole place and let the insurance investigators sort it out. Of course, that might leave you with some explaining to do about why your criminal operation went up in smoke. David's face went white. You can't just burn down a storage facility. You're right, Jake said reasonably. That would be wrong. Property damage, potential danger to innocent people. We couldn't do that. I watched as relief flooded David's face. Relief that lasted exactly as long as it took Jake to continue speaking. But we could certainly remove all your equipment, documents, and stolen money first. Load it all up in a truck, take it somewhere safe and isolated, and then have ourselves a little bonfire. Completely legal disposal of evidence in a criminal operation. The psychological warfare was brutal and effective. Within an hour, David was making phone calls to liquidate accounts and arrange refunds to victims. His 2 partners, when presented with the same choice, proved equally cooperative. But the Iron Wolves weren't finished yet. See, the thing is, Marcus explained to the 3 scammers as they cowered in their emptied storage unit, we don't trust you to stay reformed. Prison might teach you not to get caught, but it won't teach you not to hurt people. So we're going to provide some additional motivation. What happened next was both terrifying and oddly beautiful in its precision. The Iron Wolves had researched each of the scammers' backgrounds, their families, their legitimate jobs, their social circles. Jake pulled out a thick folder and began reading aloud: home addresses, employers, family members' names, even details about their children's schools and their wives' workplaces. Now, we're not going to hurt anyone, Jake said calmly. But we're going to be watching. Forever. You see, we've got chapters in 7 states and connections in dozens more. If any of you ever runs another scam, if you ever hurt another elderly person, if you ever so much as jaywalk in a way that annoys us, we'll know. The psychological torture was exquisite. These men who had built their lives on intimidating vulnerable people were now facing the reality of being permanently under threat themselves. But here's the beautiful part, Marcus added with genuine enthusiasm. We're not just going to be watching you. We're going to be watching out for potential victims too. Every senior center, every elderly care facility, every retirement community in the region is going to know your faces and your methods. You're not just unemployed now, you're unemployable in your chosen profession. Tommy produced a stack of flyers with the scammers' photos, real names, and detailed descriptions of their methods. These are going out to every police department, every community organization, every neighborhood watch group in 3 states. You're going to be famous, boys. The final blow was the most elegant of all. Oh, and about that video of you confessing to assaulting an 82-year-old man, Jake said to David. That's going to every social media platform, every local news station, and every law enforcement agency we can find. Along with all the evidence from your operation here. David looked like he was going to vomit. You said if we cooperated. We said we wouldn't hurt you, Marcus corrected. We never said we wouldn't ruin you. There's a difference. 2 weeks later, I was back in the hospital. Not as a visitor this time, but as part of a celebration. Grandpa was getting his cast removed, and his spirits had returned along with the use of his arm. The investigation that followed our anonymous tip to law enforcement had been swift and thorough. All 3 scammers were facing multiple felony charges across 3 counties. The stolen money, every penny of it, had been returned to victims. The fake HOA scam was front-page news for a week, warning other potential victims and leading to the discovery of similar operations in neighboring states. But the best part was watching my grandfather's transformation back to his old self. You know, Mija, he said as we walked through his garden, admiring the tomatoes that were finally ripening, I keep thinking about those men. Not with anger anymore, but with something like pity. Pity? I asked, surprised. They spent so much time and energy hurting people, but what did they really accomplish? They made some money, sure, but at the cost of their freedom, their reputations, their family's safety and happiness. Meanwhile, look what they brought out in our family. He gestured toward the street, where Marcus was teaching my teenage nephew how to properly maintain a motorcycle engine. A surprisingly tender scene of mentorship and patience. I never really knew your cousin before this, Grandpa continued. I saw the tattoos and the leather and made assumptions. But that boy has more honor in his little finger than those scammers had in their entire bodies. It was true. Marcus had become a regular fixture at family gatherings, bringing his club brothers along to barbecues and birthday parties. Turns out that underneath all the intimidating exterior, the Iron Wolves were deeply committed to family loyalty and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. There's something else, Grandpa said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Something I haven't told you yet. He led me to his front porch, where a small bronze plaque had been mounted beside the door. This home is protected by the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, I read aloud. Scammers, thieves, and those who prey on the elderly, find somewhere else to work. I burst out laughing. Grandpa, you didn't. Oh, but I did. And it's not just me. 17 other elderly homeowners in the area have requested similar plaques. Marcus says they're becoming the club's biggest fundraiser. The irony was perfect. A group of men who looked like society's outlaws had become the neighborhood's most trusted protectors. The same appearance that made them intimidating too. Criminals made them beloved by elderly residents who felt safer knowing the Iron Wolves were watching out for them. 6 months later, I got a call from a local news station wanting to do a follow-up story. The fake HOA scam had been completely dismantled, with copycat operations in 4 other states shut down as well. The 3 original scammers were serving significant prison sentences, and restitution had been made to over 200 victims across the region. But the story had evolved into something bigger. The Iron Wolves had formalized their elderly protection program, partnering with law enforcement and community organizations to educate seniors about scams and provide a reporting system for suspicious activity. What had started as family vengeance had become a model for community-based crime prevention. So, the reporter asked me during our interview, what's the most important lesson from all this? I thought about my grandfather's broken arm, about the fear in Mrs. Chen's eyes, about David's confident smirk as he threatened me in that coffee shop. Then I thought about Marcus's fierce loyalty, about Jake's strategic brilliance, about the way a group of supposed outcasts had become heroes. I think it's that families come in all shapes and sizes, I said finally. And sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. But mostly, it's that you should never underestimate what people will do to protect the ones they love. As I spoke, I could see Marcus in the background, teaching another group of seniors about internet safety in the community center parking lot. His leather jacket was decorated with patches reading, Grandpa's Guardian Angel, and Senior Citizen Protector. Gifts from grateful families whose elderly members now felt secure in their own homes. The fake HOA thugs had thought they could prey on the vulnerable with impunity. They'd picked the wrong grandfather to mess with, and they'd awakened a sleeping giant of family loyalty and community protection they never saw coming. Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes justice has to come from unexpected places. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people who look the most dangerous turn out to be exactly the protection you need. My grandfather's arm healed completely, but the bonds forged in those weeks of seeking justice became permanent. The Iron Wolves had found a new mission, the community had found new protectors, and I'd learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about who shows up when you need them most. The scammers learned that lesson too, though probably not in the way they'd hoped. And somewhere in their prison cells, I hope they remember that before you break an old man's arm, you might want to find out who's going to come looking for answers. Because you never know when that sweet little granddaughter might have cousins who ride motorcycles and believe in a very personal form of justice.